Right to Life Radio with John Gerardi on Power Talk 96.7 and AM 1400, a production of the Right to Life of Central California. And now, here's your host, John Gerardi.
Some weeks you got a lot of happy stuff to talk about. Some weeks on this show we have accomplishments and good things to promote and talk about. And then some weeks there's not a lot of good stuff to talk about. This week in particular, unfortunately, is one of those bad weeks as we have a couple of really significant attacks on human life coming out of Congress, coming out of the California legislature, and with the Senate confirmation of Javier Becerra to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. So today we're going to talk about a lot of that stuff right here on Right to Life Radio. I am John Gerardi. I'm the director at Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. Our buddy Jonathan Keller couldn't be here today, but I will be holding down the fort for him as we dive into some of the most important pro-life topics of the day. If you want to learn more about Right to Life of Central California, go to rtlcc.org. If you want to participate in our 40 Days for Life campaign, give us a call at Right to Life during the week at 559-229-2229. All right, so let's dig into some of the main topics of the day. I think I want to start, oddly enough, with the massive COVID relief bill that was passed this past week, and I want to talk about it from the good and the bad. Because I think there's might be some things in it you can possibly argue are good, but there's certainly a lot bad in it, and it has set a kind of unprecedented, well, not unprecedented, but certainly unique over the last 50 or so years, a bad precedent, and has some troubling long-term implications. So let's dig into it. Now, many of you know that earlier this week, President Biden signed a massive $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. And this bill does a number of things. It includes massive bailouts of state and local governments that have seen their revenues depleted during COVID. It involves a little bit of money. I think it's only 7 to 9% of the funding is actually geared towards vaccine distribution and stuff like that. And then you see, with a huge, massive federal spending bill like this, you're always going to see little wasteful pork barrel projects being funded. And that is definitely the case. However, what is the massive change that we are seeing with this COVID relief bill? The massive change that we are seeing is that this is a huge federal spending bill, which involves a decent amount of spending on healthcare. And since 1976, anytime the federal government has passed a massive federal spending bill, it has always had Hyde Amendment language in it. Now, the Hyde Amendment, for those who don't know, is this rider, this bit of language that gets attached through an amendment process every year to the federal budget and to every major federal spending program, every major federal spending bill that relates to healthcare stuff. And basically what the Hyde Amendment does is it says the federal government is not going to directly pay for, not going to directly fund abortion. Now, the federal government funds abortion providers, okay? Planned Parenthood gets a lot of money, but we should note that the money Planned Parenthood gets, the vast majority of it is from the Medicaid program and Title X, although President Trump cut off their Title X funding. And that money was to reimburse Planned Parenthood for non-abortion services. It does not pay for abortion, okay? So basically, Planned Parenthood gets about $450 million per year from the federal Medicaid program, and that is in the form of Medicaid reimbursements, insurance reimbursements for non-abortion services that Planned Parenthood provides. Okay, if Planned Parenthood does STD test or STD treatment or something, they're dealing with a Medi-Cal patient, they get reimbursed from Medi-Cal. Medi-Cal is California's state Medicaid program. Okay, and so they get some federal dollars to reimburse them for the cost of that service. So that is the major bulk of Planned Parenthood's government funding is Medicaid reimbursements for non-abortion services. Now, it's a bit of a shell game because, money is fungible. And yes, Planned Parenthood isn't getting money directly to fund its abortion services. But and by fungibility, what I mean is if I give you $20 and say, don't use this money to go to the movies, but you already had $20 in your pocket and you say, oh, well, I'll hold on to this $20 bill and I won't use this $20 bill to go to the movies, but you freed me up so I can use the other $20 bill that was already in my pocket so I can use that to go to the movies, okay? Money is fungible. If you get money that's allocated for one purpose, it frees up your existing resources to do other stuff. So without question, the money that the federal government gives Planned Parenthood supports their abortion work. Nevertheless, Planned Parenthood is not allowed to get money from the federal government that directly pays for abortion, and that's the result of the Hyde Amendment. Now, the Hyde Amendment, over the course of time, got weakened a little bit. The Hyde Amendment, it went from cutting off federal funding for any abortions to cutting off federal funding for any abortions except in cases of rape or incest. But nevertheless, the Hyde Amendment was, in many ways, as we had Professor Michael New on the show a couple weeks ago, and for an educational event we did at Right to Life. He's a researcher at Catholic University of America, and he's done the research to show the Hyde Amendment is, in some ways, the most effective piece of pro-life legislation in history. That because, and it's basic economics, if the government subsidizes something, pays for it, makes it free by paying for it with taxpayer dollars, it makes that thing easier to get and people are more likely to get it. And Dr. New, through his research and reviewing other people's research, has come to the conclusion that because the Hyde Amendment has been in place since 1976, some 2 million children were not aborted who otherwise might have been. So the Hyde Amendment is this hugely important thing. And for years, the Hyde Amendment was very much a bipartisan consensus. The Democrats of the abortion should be safe, legal, and rare mindset, Democrats of the 90s, a lot of them were of the opinion that, well, I think abortion should be legal, but I agree that we shouldn't force taxpayers to pay for it. And a lot of Democrats maintain that position, among them Senator Joe Biden. For his 30-plus years in the United States Senate, Joe Biden supported the Hyde Amendment, voted for the Hyde Amendment, promoted the Hyde Amendment as being consistent with his Catholic beliefs, specifically said that he supported the Hyde Amendment because of his Roman Catholic faith. Yet, there has been a huge change rhetorically on the pro-abortion side. As we said, for years, especially in the 90s, the guiding terminology, the guiding slogan was that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. And rarity was a thing. A lot of Democrats at that time didn't think that we needed to have the government pay for abortion, fund abortion, make abortion super common. They thought of abortion as something maybe that's tragically necessary. From, I would say, the 2000s until 2010, maybe over the course of about 15 years in the 2000s, and I think a lot of this had to do with the advocacy of Cecile Richards, the longtime CEO of Planned Parenthood. The mindset changed. And the mindset changed from safe, legal, and rare to abortion should be safe, legal, and universally accessible. And the idea that abortion should be accessible, that there should be absolutely no stumbling block, no hindrance, no barrier to entry for women to get abortion, that translated itself into a lot of new and hyper-aggressive left-wing policies in favor of abortion. Knocking down conscience protections for doctors, hospitals, et cetera, that don't want to do abortion. Because if you're the only hospital in the area and you're, for example, a Catholic hospital and you don't do abortions, well, you're depriving access to women who need abortions. Government funding for abortion is very consistent with this notion that abortion should be safe, legal, and universally accessible. If someone doesn't have the money to pay for an abortion, the government should pay for it for them. This mindset became so powerful and influential among key Democratic Party stakeholders, key advocacy groups within the Democrat coalition for example, Planned Parenthood, that by 2016, the Democratic Party changed its platform. So the platform is every 4 years, the two major political parties at their convention before the presidential election, they release their platform. It's a big, long document that lists what the party believes on all of the major political issues of the day. Okay, and that's the orthodoxy against which the members of that party can be judged. The Democratic Party in 2016, for the first time in its history, or since the Hyde Amendment was first introduced in 1976, and for its whole history, the Hyde Amendment had received bipartisan support. In 2016, the Democratic Party for the first time announced its party-wide opposition to the Hyde Amendment. And Hillary Clinton was the first major presidential candidate of the post-Roe era to oppose the Hyde Amendment. Joe Biden became the second such candidate, and Joe Biden is now the first president of the Roe era, of the post-Roe era, to oppose the Hyde Amendment. Now, what happened to Joe? Joe voted for the Hyde Amendment throughout his career in the Senate. In 2019, over the course of 1 week, Joe Biden was asked at a press conference, hey, do you think we got to get rid of the Hyde Amendment? Biden clearly did not remember what the Hyde Amendment was and agreed with the questioner, saying, yeah, the Hyde Amendment's terrible. And then people said, whoa, did you just change your policy position that you've held on this for 40 plus years? Then he released a statement to clarify, saying, no, Joe Biden still supports the Hyde Amendment. It's due to his deep religious convictions as a Roman Catholic. He then received a ton of heat from Democrat activists. And again, this is 2019. He's running in the primary. And Biden quickly realized if he wants the nomination, he has to change his position on the Hyde Amendment. The very next day, Biden announced that he is changing his position on the Hyde Amendment. So within the course of 3 days, Biden altered his 40-plus year position in favor of the Hyde Amendment because a couple of Democrat activists yelled at him, and he realized he couldn't get the nomination if he maintained his support for the Hyde Amendment. The COVID bill that was signed this week is the first major federal spending bill of the Roe era, I guess since 1976 when the Hyde Amendment was first introduced, the first major federal spending bill not to include Hyde language. Now, a lot of the COVID relief bill doesn't really have much to do with funding healthcare provision, but some of it does, and it's going to result in millions and millions of dollars, not just supporting abortion providers for their non-abortion services, but actually directly paying for abortion, actually directly funding abortion. This is a dark day in a lot of ways. It signals sort of the death knell of any kind of bipartisan cooperation when it comes to the life issue. There's very little common ground left anymore when it comes to abortion. Democrats and Republicans, between this and the confirmation of Javier Becerra as Secretary of Health and Human Services, there is very little left. Effectively, there is nothing left, I would say. There used to be Democrat and Republican, cooperation on the notion that maybe partial birth abortion should be illegal. There used to be Democrat and Republican cooperation on the notion that we should have, robust conscience protections for religious hospitals that didn't want to do abortions. We'll talk about that later in the show. There used to be a bipartisan consensus that regardless of what you think about abortion, that the American taxpayer shouldn't be coerced into funding it. And with the COVID bill today, which could not have passed without the support of allegedly pro-life Democrats like Joe Manchin, who apparently tried to keep Hyde protection in but was unable to do so, we now see for the first time for the first time since the 70s, the federal government directly funding abortion, and it's not going to stop there. Now, failure has a lot of fathers. You can blame Mitch McConnell for the Georgia Senate losses. You can blame Donald Trump for the Georgia Senate losses. If Republicans had maintained control of the Senate, we would not be at this point. But it goes to show, elections have consequences, and this was going to be one of the chief consequences of Republicans losing control of the Senate. Was if the Democrats have control of the House, if they have control of the Senate, they have control of the White House, the Hyde Amendment was going to be in big trouble, and indeed, in this COVID bill, there is no Hyde protection. All right, when we return, we're going to talk a little bit about Javier Becerra and his confirmation at HHS. That's next. Frank Sinatra playing us in on Right to Life Radio. This is New York, New York. I'll tell you one person I don't want to be right now is Andrew Cuomo, who is nothing to do with abortion stuff. He's just seems like he might get impeached as governor of New York, and he's got the mayor of New York calling for him to step down, and basically the entire. I think he sort of served his usefulness as a foil to President Trump during COVID, and now the Democrats are kind of turning on him. The long knives are out for poor Andrew Cuomo. Anyway, not poor Andrew Cuomo, because he did genuinely do some stuff that I don't think was great as far as... Anyway, but that's neither here nor there to the subject matter of this show. Thank you so much for listening to Right to Life Radio, a production, as always, of Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. All right, I am leery to do my umpteenth segment on Javier Becerra. Javier Becerra was the Attorney General of the state of California and is now going to be the Secretary for the Department of Health and Human Services. Jonathan and I had been holding out hope that maybe Becerra could be stopped, but it appears that Senator Joe Manchin is going to vote for him, as well as Senator Susan Collins from Maine, the Republican senator from Maine, which kind of guarantees that he is going to get confirmed. Now, why did we care about this? Javier Becerra, as Attorney General of California, and before that, for years and years and years, as a member of the House of Representatives representing California, has distinguished himself as a true zealot for abortion rights. Planned Parenthood could not contain their giddiness when it was announced that Becerra was going to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And I just want to emphasize how important this is. The Department of Health and Human Services, I have their Wikipedia page up here, so take it with a grain of salt. As of 2020, HHS's annual budget was $1.286 trillion. $1.286 trillion. That's 1,286 billions, which is so much money you cannot even fathom it. They have about 80,000 employees. They oversee health care related policy in an unthinkably huge number of facets all throughout the federal government, whether it's the CDC, whether it's the National Institutes of Health, whether it's this, whether it's that. Research funding for stem cells is under them. The HHS mandate about contraception requirements and abortifacient contraception requirements. This, that, Title X funding, abortion funding, whether or not to fund. There's just, I cannot express how much stuff and how much critically important stuff that relates to abortion. How you regulate the abortion pill, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration is under them. This is all under the purview of the Department of Health and Human Services. It's maybe the most it's maybe the most important department of the federal government in certain ways. I mean, maybe you can make an argument for the Department of Justice. Maybe you can make an argument for the Secretary of State, the Department of State. Certainly when it comes to domestic policy, nobody comes. It's hard to think of anyone who's coming too close to Health and Human Services. And the Biden administration has staffed it at the top with the most radical, the most left-wing, the most hard-line member of Biden's cabinet is in charge. And it's in contrast, frankly, to what Biden has done in other departments. In other departments, Biden has nominated people who are relatively moderate. Okay, at the Department of Justice, Merrick Garland, President Obama's ill-fated pick for the Supreme Court, who has been the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit for a long time, a former federal prosecutor, relatively moderate choice for the Department of Justice. A lot of Biden's picks for cabinet-level positions have been fairly mainstream people, not radicals by any stretch. Becerra is different. Becerra is a radical. Becerra has no background experience in public health. He's not even really qualified for the job. He has appointed the most radical partisan he could possibly find at a time when, in the pandemic, you'd probably prefer to have some bipartisan support, or at least the appearance of relatively apolitical leadership. And with Becerra in charge, it signals something very clear. Joe Biden is going to pursue some of the most aggressive pro-abortion policies you can possibly fathom. When we come back, we'll talk about some of those policies that Mr. Becerra pursued in California and which are being pursued in the state legislature, attacks on religious liberty for Catholic hospitals and religious healthcare employers throughout the state of California. That is next on Right to Life Radio. Tony Bennett here with us on Right to Life Radio, the best bumper music in the greater Fresno area radio market, and some might say the entire world. Thank you so much for listening to Right to Life Radio. Again, a production of Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. All right. Now, on this segment of the show, I've been bewailing Javier Becerra at HHS. But the legacy of Javier Becerra lives on, and a lot of the things that were important to him, our state legislature is taking up. And it seemed that last year, because of the massive disruption to the state legislature, there wasn't a ton of legislation pursued that had to do with abortion-related topics, and it seems as though they're gearing up for this year. And what we're about to see is a real collision course on the topic of, I think religious liberty is going to be a major topic in the California legislature over the course of this year. And what the California legislature can get away with, what kinds of things the Ninth Circuit will allow them to do, what kinds of things the Supreme Court will allow them to do. Because basically the state legislature is preparing an all-out assault on the First Amendment conscience rights, the free exercise of religion rights of healthcare providers who don't want to do abortion and healthcare providers who don't want to provide or make formal referrals for physician-assisted suicide. And there are two bills chiefly that have to do with that. Now, the one bill that we're concerned with doesn't really have to do with that. It's basically it's this bill to make abortion free. So this piece of legislation, SB 245, is going to just require insurance companies to take away any copays, any deductibles for abortion. And basically all abortion will be totally free to the patient. And obviously to make abortion more accessible, cheaper for everyone. All right, but I want to focus on these two bills that are going to be direct attacks on religious liberty. So the first of these that I'm going to talk about is AB 705. Now, AB 705 has to do with Catholic hospitals chiefly, and other religious hospitals too that don't provide abortion, but Catholic hospitals are kind of the big players as far as religious hospitals in California. There are a lot of Catholic hospitals throughout the state, and Catholic hospitals, like other religious hospitals that hold to a more Orthodox Christian tradition when it comes to ethics, don't perform abortions. Don't provide various kinds of contraceptive services, don't do various kinds of transgender treatments, things like that. The faith tradition that these hospitals were founded upon excludes the possibility of Catholic hospitals doing these things. All right. Javier Becerra, when he was Attorney General, was very concerned about the fact that there were certain Catholic hospital chains that were engaging in mergers within the state. And his concern was not like some kind of antitrust concern. His concern was about abortion. He said, look, if you've got Catholic hospitals merging with other chains and this whole chain is sort of cutting off the possibility of doing abortion, where is that going to leave women who need access to abortion? Basically, you're going to have a huge percentage of the healthcare providers throughout the state just won't do abortions. And Becerra thought that this was unacceptable and bad and pursued legal action as the Attorney General of California, looking into how to stop that. Well, Becerra may be gone from California, maybe leaving the roost to go to the delightful environs of Washington, D.C. to run the Department of Health and Human Services, but his concerns live on. And the chief way that his concern is living on is through AB 705, Assembly Bill 705. Now, this bill is called the Peace Act. That is the euphemism that is the euphemism that is being used to describe this bill. Basically, it stands for protecting everyone's access to care everywhere. Okay, I think that's what it stands for, the Peace Act. But it's not about anything peaceful. This is about abortion. And what this bill would do is force religious healthcare providers against their conscientious, the conscientious background, the religious background according to which they were founded, would force these entities to perform abortions. And it's in response to these mergers by Catholic hospitals. And again, it's to carry out Javier Becerra's agenda, okay? He was concerned that by having all these hospitals who are Catholics, I mean, one of the things that the ACLU has argued for years is that if a Catholic hospital is the only hospital within a certain region, maybe you've got a more remote part of a more rural area, and the only nearby hospital is a Catholic hospital. Well, if that hospital won't do abortions, the argument is that it is engaging in a form of unlawful discrimination on the basis of sex. Basically, the argument from the ACLU and others is, look, abortion is essential women's health care. Abortion is essential women's health care. And if you are presenting yourself as a hospital, but you're refusing to provide this basic aspect of women's health care, then that is a form of discrimination against women. And this line of reasoning by the ACLU has been met with sort of poo-poos and has not been taken very seriously. The ACLU has sued Dignity Health and I believe and other Catholic hospital chains to try to force them to do abortions. Those lawsuits have not been successful, but they were seeding the ground. They were preparing the legal arguments for this moment right here with AB 705. And this is being done in the name of advancing women's rights to abortion, etc. And what we're going to see, we're setting up a massive clash between conscience rights and women's rights to abortion, whatever the constitutional right to abortion is and the extent of it. Now, it's not just in the realm of abortion. AB 705 would have an impact on assisted suicide, but even further, we have another bill dealing with assisted suicide that also deals with conscience protections, okay? SB 380, Senate Bill 380, is basically going to weaken the already very weak protections that exist around physician-assisted suicide, okay? Assisted suicide, basically, one of the fundamental problems with assisted suicide, other than taking human life, is directly taking human life is always bad. Innocent human life is always bad. The vast majority of people, or a hugely significant percentage of people who are diagnosed with a terminal illness, are suffering or will suffer at some point from depression. And the vast majority of people who seek suicide are suffering from some form of clinically diagnosable depression. And they can be assisted while they're suffering from that, okay? However, of the people who seek out physician-assisted suicide, a minuscule percentage of them are actually recommended by the doctor from whom they are seeking physician-assisted suicide. A minuscule percentage of them are actually asked to look for any kind of mental health screening before the doctor will okay them to receive basically life-ending pills. This law is going to even lower that bar even further by, instead of having a physician refer them to a psychiatrist or a psychologist for a mental health evaluation, it'll allow just a clinical social worker to do the mental health evaluation. But the other big thing that this does, that I think is almost worse, is the attack on religious liberty. Basically, this bill would force physicians who do not wish to participate in physician-assisted suicide in any way, shape, or form. So let's take someone like my dad, okay? My dad is a surgeon at Valley Children's Hospital. Now, Valley Children's doesn't really have much to do with physician-assisted suicide anyway, because most of their patients are minors, but they do have some adult patients, some 18-year-olds, 18, 19-year-olds who are still under the care of their parents, etc. And Valley Children's as an institution, with my dad being one of the people sort of leading the charge, voted not to have anything to do with physician-assisted suicide. They weren't going to prescribe it, weren't going to do it, even for 18-year-old patients. Well, this bill would basically override those conscience rights. It would require a physician or the healthcare provider who doesn't want to even participate in physician-assisted suicide, it would require them at least to do formal referrals of patients to another doctor who will do it. And this is what we would, I think that is wrong. You shouldn't force any doctor to do a referral, okay? This is almost as bad. I mean, and the moral distinction that the left, that the pro-assisted suicide group is trying to make, they're trying to say, well, we're not going to force you to prescribe physician-assisted suicide. Well, you're still forcing me to participate. You're forcing me to recommend it, okay? If you're looking for an abortion and you come to me as a doctor or as a physician and say, I want an abortion, I say, let me give you a referral to this other practice because I don't do it. Because I don't do it. I mean, what moral... There's no moral difference I've made. It's just I'm saying I'm not going to do it. But here, let me help you do the thing you want to do. That's formal cooperation with your evil. I'm referring you out to another doctor who's going to do it. Similarly, this is not a defense of the conscience rights of the doctors. It's not the fact that, I'm the one actually signing the prescription for your life-ending medication. No, I also don't want to give you a formal referral to the other doctor who's going to do it because I know he'll do it. No. Physicians, and this is not some abstruse, perverse religious dogma. The way that the left is attacking religious healthcare providers, both in AB 705, which is going to force religious hospitals to do practices that they're opposed to, and SB 380, is by acting as though the conscientious objections of these doctors are, well, they're opposed to science. They're not based in best practices. It goes against the weight of medical evidence and blah, blah. Stop. We're talking about ethics. We're talking about certain conceptions of human nature, all right? This isn't something that you can get data points for to measure whether or not the position is reasonable or not reasonable. Right? This isn't a math equation. This is a moral stance that these doctors are taking. It's a moral stance that these doctors say, well, it's not necessarily medically advisable. No, we're saying that it is ethically wrong. You have doctors who've taken this oath to say, do no harm. They're not going to actively harm people. They're not going to actively refer patients out so that they can harm themselves. And it's setting us up for a real clash. A real clash that I think at some point is going to have to be resolved by the Supreme Court. And you can see this in other areas of public controversy. You can see this in LGBT issues. What are we as a country, what is American law going to hold as being more important? The right to abortion? Or the right, even maybe we frame it differently, the right to access abortion, the right to have other people furnish abortion for you, or the right to live out the ethical dictates of your religion. What's going to be more important? The right to free exercise of religion. Remember, the First Amendment doesn't say right to freedom of worship. It says right to free exercise of religion. And that's a difference. Those are different things. Don't say that the First Amendment protects freedom of worship. Okay, worship is probably included in exercise of religion, but exercise of religion is a broader category. So what's going to be more important? The right to free exercise of religion, something I will note that is actually in the Constitution, or the right to access abortion, something that's not actually in the text of the Constitution, but was, whipped up by Supreme Court decisions from the 70s and then the early 90s. That's what we have to decide. That's what our court system has to decide. And thank God that Amy Barrett is on the court. Thank God that Neil Gorsuch is on the court. And thank God that Brett Kavanaugh is on the court. Because I shudder to think what a series of Hillary Clinton appointees to the Supreme Court would how they would view these controversies. And especially in the person of Neil Gorsuch, especially with Amy Barrett, I feel very confident that if it comes down to the Supreme Court having to decide one way or another, that they're going to do the right thing. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about this assisted suicide bill and more into the problems with assisted suicide after the break. This is Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400. Right to Life in Central California with Right to Life Radio. Louis Prima here with us. So my wife and I recently watched the movie The Big Night, where the whole premise of The Big Night is that these two brothers and their struggling Italian restaurant would be visited by Louis Prima, and he would bring such a big crowd to them and so much publicity that it would save the restaurant, and then Louis Prima never shows up. But there is a lot of good Italian cooking It is a much more depressing movie than I had thought it was going in. So don't really recommend it. Anyway, with that aside, let's turn to what the state legislature is trying to do. So as I've been mentioning through the show, the state legislature has introduced a bill, Senate Bill 380. And this is introduced by Senator Susan Eggman, who's a Democrat from Stockton. Senator Eggman was the senator who introduced the physician-assisted suicide bill that passed the legislature in 2015, which Jerry Brown signed in 2015 and which came into law in 2016. And she is already working to, one, loosen the restrictions against assisted suicide, and two, attack the religious liberty rights of doctors who don't want to participate with physician-assisted suicide. And I want to get to the protections around assisted suicide because one of the things that physician-assisted suicide advocates have argued ever since Oregon legalized assisted suicide in the 90s, they have tried to argue there's no evidence of any abuse of the system. No evidence that people are trying to bump off grandma to get inheritance. There's no evidence of any abuse in the system. No evidence. The reason why there's no evidence is because they have set up systems for physician-assisted suicide that make it impossible to find instances of abuse. Let me explain. When you die of physician-assisted suicide, again, to qualify for physician-assisted suicide, I got this wrong last week. I said a 1-year terminal diagnosis. It's actually just a 6-month terminal diagnosis. Some liberals have been advocating to change that to a 1-year terminal diagnosis, which I think would be a disaster. So if you have a 6-month terminal diagnosis, you can seek a prescription from a doctor for physician-assisted suicide, basically for a bottle of pills that'll kill you when you take it. And the various protections in place are super minimal. When you die from your physician-assisted suicide, the doctor is forced to lie on your death certificate and to say that the cause of your death was not physician-assisted suicide pills, but rather that it was your underlying condition that allowed you to qualify for physician-assisted suicide in the first place. So if you die under suspicious circumstances with Cousin Clem in the house or something, and Cousin Clem is the one who stands to inherit the house, well, the cause of death is, brain cancer. That's what's on the death certificate. So what's the rationale, the justification for doing an autopsy? For seeing whether Cousin Clem tried to force the pill down your throat or something. Whether Cousin Clem maybe snuck the pill into your drink. Also, you don't take physician-assisted suicide pills. There's no requirement that you take them in the presence of a physician. You just take them on your own. You can take them in the bathtub. You can take them while hiking, at the top of a mountain. You can take them anywhere you want. So there's no physician to oversee the circumstances under which you took the medication. The medication, I say in scare quotes, it's really rat poison. Further, when it comes to mental health, and this bill is going to further loosen up the mental health side effect, the vast majority of people who are suicidal are suffering from clinically diagnosable depression. And a tiny, minuscule minority of patients who seek out physician-assisted suicide are referred for any kind of mental health evaluation, which is bonkers. So there are all of the, I think the inherent practice of allowing people to kill themselves is bad. Okay? We should try to do anything possible to alleviate people's suffering. We should try to advance palliative care. In fact, what we see in states that have legalized assisted suicide is that palliative care always suffers in that state when assisted suicide is legal. But even the idea that, well, there could be all these abuses in the system. Oh, it's okay. Oregon hasn't seen any abuses in the system. Yeah, because they've set up a system where it's impossible to find, detect, and then report abuses. So we need to fight against physician-assisted suicide. We need to fight against SB 380, which would loosen up the already loosey-goosey mental health protections against physician-assisted suicide, and which will attack the conscience rights of doctors who don't wish to participate in it. All right. Dean Martin will be playing us out. Thank you all so much for listening to Right to Life Radio, and we will see you next week.